Hello, everyone. Sorry about the delay. Hello to Saint Murad and Veronica and Play Zone 31. I'm back and just going to go straight into the PowerPoint and share it, and hopefully there's no issues. Just bring it up. Go straight into the PowerPoint and share it. Bit of an echo there. No issues. Bring it up. Okay. Now get started. Just make sure it's up. Okay, ready to start. Sorry about the delay. I had to switch computers there. So as you can see from the title of Images and Idols, it's a big, huge topic. I've been looking at it over the past few weeks in different ways, and it's quite a difficult one to break down into chunks, but I've decided I have a good part of it ready, and I thought I'd do this section, call it episode 1, which is in 3 parts. And the topic is really a fresh exploration into the history of how images and statues are viewed by Islam through the direct evidence of artifacts. Now, I will be referring to hadiths, but I don't trust the hadiths. And if you're familiar with the channel, you will know that we've covered over a lot of videos the reasons why the hadiths are not trustworthy. And so let's begin then. So part 1 is what is typically asserted, and I mean by whom? I mean by your average Muslim, by a member of the Dawah team, the majority of Muslims. I know there are exceptions, but generally speaking, in terms of images and idols, if you ask your average Muslim, it will be asserted one of the following: that there was a universal ban on making images of Muhammad from the 7th century onwards. And secondly, there was a universal ban from the time of Muhammad on making images of humans and animals for fear of adultery. Related to that was a ban on going to graves and making mausoleums, which might also lead to idolatry. So basically, there was a ban on anything that might lead to idolatry. Okay, so that's something that you will have heard yourselves. And, this is all part of the standard Islamic narrative. It's one part of it. But just to give you an example of how this is often asserted, here's a quote from CNN. The article was called "Why Islam Forbids Images of Muhammad." It says, "Nothing in the Quran, Islam's holy book, strictly bars portrayals of Muhammad, but the faith, like the Hebrew Bible's 10 Commandments, has long discouraged any graven images, scholars say, to avoid the temptation towards idol worship." Okay. It goes on to say, "In some ways, early Muslims were reacting to Christianity, which they believed had been led astray by conceiving of Christ not as a man but as a God. They did not want the same thing to happen to Muhammad." Here's the key bit. "The Prophet himself was aware that if people saw his face portrayed by people, they would soon start worshipping." Akbar Ahmed, who chairs the Islamic Studies Department at American University, told CNN. So he himself spoke against such images, saying, "I am just a man." Again, but is that actually true, that claim? It seems like the standard Islamic narrative is being accepted hook, line, and sinker here by CNN, and it's not really questioned. This is the common claim. It goes on to say, "In Sunni mosques, the largest branch of the faith, there are no human images of any kind. The spaces are instead decorated with verses from the Quran." certainly as a statement about what goes on in the mosques today, that's certainly true. Goes on to say, but there have been historical instances of Muslims depicting the Prophet, especially in Shiite branches of Islam. Umud Safi, a religious studies professor at Duke University, told CNN. And that's actually true. Safi goes on to say, we have had visual depictions of the Prophet in the form of miniatures and pictures in the Iranian context, the Turkish context, the Central Asian context, says Safi. The one significant context where depictions of the Prophet have not been image related has been in the Arab context. Now, I put a question mark beside that because I think that is begging to be checked and possibly debunked. But certainly that is a commonly held position. It may be true, it may not be. It would be interesting to see if that was true in the early days. Johari Abdul Malik, the Imam for Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia, told CNN that depictions of the Prophet's teachings were sometimes used to bridge gaps in illiteracy. So there's a kind of a concession there. What does that mean? Essentially, I think that's a he, Johari, is saying that images could be used in order to educate the illiterate. And so we could actually imagine that in the early days, at least, images, including perhaps statues, could have been used to depict different scenes from the Sirah, because let's be frank, a lot of people were illiterate. So how are they going to, as it says here, bridge that gap in illiteracy, apart from helping them by showing the stories through images? Even historical renditions of Muhammad by Muslim artists were careful not to paint the Prophet in too much detail. Now, the person is thinking of actually a later period, a relatively recent period, during Ottoman times, when the image of Muhammad was done in such a way that the face was not visible. But is that always true? Was that always the case? Have a look at this one. This is a painting of Prophet Muhammad's vision in Mecca from Tabriz, 1320 AD. Did this artist avoid painting Muhammad in too much detail? I think he's clearly shown in full detail. We can even see the blushes on his cheeks, which is something that's mentioned in the Sirah and in the Hadiths as well. Okay, so that's a major contradiction of the idea that most Muslims have, which is that images of Muhammad were generally frowned upon and not accepted. But here we have a sponsored picture. This was not someone randomly going against the flow, going against the general opinion. This must have been accepted. It was certainly preserved, and that suggests that there were at least some who were in favor back in what is the 14th century in favor of depicting Muhammad. Now, Sheikh Ibrahim Magra, an imam in Leicester and Assistant Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Great Britain, so in other words, chief spokesman of Muslims in Britain, told the BBC, Islam in general specifically forbids the usage of imagery. Okay, so notice it's the use of imagery in general. And when it comes to depicting the messenger Muhammad, peace be upon him, that prohibition becomes even more relevant. We are not allowed to depict him in any shape, any way, or form. So he there has really just backed up the claim that I made earlier on, that there is a general idea that there was a universal prohibition around images, in particular images of Muhammad. Nasima Begum says views didn't change, but it was 9 centuries before images were covered up, strangely enough. Again, she's a spokeswoman for the Muslim Council of Great Britain. Said views on representations of Muhammad were uniform, and described the sacred art as a historical anomaly. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. It's uniform, and yet this is an anomaly. That's how uniform does she mean? The general view about depicting the Prophet hasn't changed over time, she said. However, contradicting herself, she says, it is believed that he should not be depicted whatsoever. In the 12th and 13th centuries, there may well have been books producing images of the Prophet. However, the very fact that images of his face were covered up in the 16th century or so does show that Muslims were not happy about the depictions and therefore resulted in a veil being used to cover the face. Now, let's just think about this for a second. Books being produced in the 12th and 13th centuries, this is before the printing press. That would have required an awful lot of resources to do that. And so it would have meant that it wasn't just one artist going it alone. It meant that there was a community supporting that artist, supporting that writer in depicting him in various ways like that. So I think she's been disingenuous there. Doesn't the fact that there were books that depicted Muhammad show that some Muslims were happy about that back then, just as she argues some Muslims were later not happy? I think if she wants to say that Muslims were not happy about it in the 16th century, then logically she has to admit that in the 12th and 13th century, there were Muslims who were happy with it. That the logic would have to follow from what she's just said. And so what's interesting is she's trying to claim that views didn't change, and yet, it was only in the 16th century that his face was covered up. Okay? Now, she refers to the 12th and 13th centuries, but was that just an anomaly, or was it that we don't have access to other images that are out there? Maybe there was some in the 11th century. Maybe there were some in the 10th century. Maybe in the 9th century. Who knows? In Baghdad, there was a massive collection of books that were destroyed. I think it was in the 12th century, it might be in the 13th century. So how much was lost during that event? So, we need to keep an open mind. Maybe there was a longer tradition. Certainly, it would seem that there was a longer tradition. If we look at the Shia side of Islam, they seem to have a sense that this was acceptable right up to modern times. So that's a different tradition. So we move on now to part 2. Were pictures of Muhammad really banned? Now, for this, I'm drawing from answeringislam.org, which had an article titled, Are Pictures of Muhammad Really Forbidden in Islam? And I thought this was a good bit of research, so I'm quoting it verbatim. Numerous passages in the Quran prohibit idolatry and worshipping statues or pictures, but there is not even a single verse in the Quran that explicitly or implicitly says not to have any pictures of Muhammad. This bears repeating. There is not a single verse in the Quran that prohibits making or having pictures of Muhammad, or people, or animals, or trees. In fact, there are some verses in the Quran which mention images in a positive context and which therefore presuppose that some statues or images were approved by God. Now, in terms of a biblical context, there is that distinction made in the Old Testament. Even in, I think I'm going to say it's the book of Deuteronomy, I may be mistaken, but even in a book where idolatry is prohibited, there is still allowance for the making of statues for the Ark of the Covenant, the statues of angels to be placed on either side of it. So there was that distinction, and it seems that Islam inherited those distinctions in terms of when it's acceptable and when it's not acceptable to make images, with the emphasis on graven images. It goes on to say, so that's the Quran. So it goes on to say, however, the vast majority of Muslims are Sunni Muslims who regard 6 authorized collections of hadiths as the highest written authority in Islam after the Quran. The hadiths are records, often very detailed, of what Muhammad taught and did, I would add, supposedly. We give multiple quotations to show that these teachings are not confined to just one writer or collector, but are spread throughout the different hadith collections. Okay, so this, whatever examples we give, it's spread across a lot of them. So we can't say, well, we're just cherry picking here. Where multiple trustworthy hadiths agree, Sunni Muslims will take this as binding. In other words, people today are kicked out of Islam or even killed based on the hadiths. Pictures of Muhammad are not exactly forbidden in the hadiths either. The hadiths do not single out Muhammad's picture. Rather, in the hadith, we find the prohibition of all pictures of people or animals, which would include pictures from a camera. Now, how is it then that we saw that picture of Muhammad with an angel from, was it the 13th century, 14th century? If the hadiths are the second highest authority in Islam, just hold that question out to you, you know, were the hadiths really written before that time? We assume they are because we've been told this all along, but were they? I'd like to see evidence for those specific hadiths. Were they added later? It's very suspicious that people are defying these hadiths in the 14th century. And it's only in the 16th century that we start to see images being banned. So that's suspicious. And that's when the Ottomans had power across all the different Muslim countries. Now, it goes on. For example, Sahih Muslim, Volume 3, says, Ibn Umar reported Allah's Messenger having said, those who paint pictures would be punished on the day of resurrection, and it would be said to them, breathe soul into what you have created. Notice the prohibition was not just against idolaters who made pictures, or even Muslims who made pictures for other reasons, but for anyone who made pictures. So we're not even talking about the iconoclast idea per se, which is a distinct category. We're talking about it more generally. Sahih Muslim Volume 3 gives a little more detail. This hadith has been reported on the authority of Abu Muawiyah, though another chain of transmitters, and the words are, verily the most grievously tormented people amongst the denizens of hell on the day of resurrection would be the painters of pictures. Narrated Aisha, Allah's apostle, said, the painter of these pictures will be punished on the day of resurrection, and it will be said to them, make alive what you have created. Bukhari, Volume 9. No pictures of people or animals, according to Bukhari. It doesn't finish it there. So it's basically saying you're not allowed to do pictures of people or animals, according to Bukhari. Conclusion is, it is clear that the hadiths prohibit pictures of animals or people, especially in homes. There is no focus on pictures of Muhammad per se. All pictures of people and animals are forbidden. It is a completely general prohibition. So I would suggest that if you were someone who believed in the hadiths, such as a Muslim, you're bound to have to accept that all pictures were banned from day one by Muhammad, and all of these hadiths are claiming that Muhammad taught this and passed this down the chain. Okay? So let's see if we've made that really clear. The hadiths, which are the second highest authority in Islam, broadly teach that the painting of pictures is forbidden, verboten, as they say in German. So they're forbidden, and they have been from day one, from the time of Muhammad. Okay? And Muslims accept the hadiths as true and honest with loads of chains of narration so that we can trust them. Okay? So that's the position. Now we move to part 3. This is the last part of our episode today. Early artifacts tell a completely different story to that of the hadiths. Surprise, surprise. When we look at early artifacts, it seems like the hadiths were written during a much later era, as the practice as evidenced by artifacts and the teaching as collected in hadiths are so at odds with each other as to be irreconcilable. Something is amiss. One easy solution would be to say that the hadiths were simply written at a much later date. And who's to say they weren't, at least the key hadiths, which could have been later interpolations placed into the earlier hadiths. But it is, as we'll see, quite hard to believe that we're talking about the same society when we see what the artifacts were from the time that we can date and that we can be confident of where they were and when they were made and so on, versus the hadiths, which seem to be from a Walt Disney world, a fantasy world, really. They don't seem to relate to the 8th century or 9th century. Okay, so what is the evidence? I'm going to be showing you evidence from the Umayyad and Abbasid periods. While it is unknown for sure if humans or animals were depicted in art inside mosques, in principle, the Caliphs took a very relaxed view in their own palaces and they set the agenda. They were the ones pushing the religion of Islam. And if they were really against the creation of images, it's peculiar that in their own homes, they had them all over the walls, as I'm going to show you. So, once again, the hadiths are saying all pictures, all paintings are forbidden, and yet at the very same time that these hadiths are supposed to have existed, the Caliphs, who are the leaders of the religion at the time, are not even aware of these prohibitions and are actually doing the complete opposite. Now, for this, I'm going to be drawing from Dr. Beatrice Leal and her essay, Paintings in the Early Islamic World. She is a renowned expert in this field. I am aware that she wrote a book on this question, and it's something I was trying to find the name of it before I broadcast this, but I will keep looking and see if I can retrieve the name of her book, but it's on this very question and it'll be a good book to get hold of. But she says, one of the widespread myths about Islamic art is that images of living creatures are banned. It is true that the Quran forbids the worship of idols. An idol was usually understood in antiquity and the Middle Ages in Europe and the Middle East to mean a painting or statue. For that reason, images of people and animals were almost never depicted in mosques. However, in other settings, there were plenty of images of all kinds. In fact, more figural painting in the Levant has survived from the early Islamic period, roughly the 7th to 9th centuries, than from the centuries immediately before Islam. That's quite a claim. Let's have a further look into this. So we have the Qusair Amra in the Jordan from the 730s. The best preserved early Islamic paintings are from the palaces of the Umayyad Caliphs and princes. These mostly date to the first half of the 8th century, starting with the most impressive, the bathhouse of Qusair Amra in Jordan, which was built for the Prince Al-Walid ibn Yazid. It has an audience hall and a suite of 3 bathrooms, and the walls of every room are painted with an amazing assortment of scenes, which I'm going to show you. This is it from the outside. It's like something straight out of Star Wars. I'm sure they probably got inspiration for that movie from this. Okay, so that's the outside bits. What's in the inside that's of interest? Have a look at this picture here. Does it look like there were hadiths at that time that prohibited the painting of human images? How do we explain this? Were the Caliphs just decadent hypocrites? Probably were, in fairness. Or were hadiths on this subject a later invention? I think actually maybe it's both. I can't imagine at the height of Islamic fervor in the early 8th century, just 100 years after Muhammad supposedly lived, that people were happy to have images like this, particularly in the Caliph's palace. And these had audience halls where people visited on a regular basis. If there was a general prohibition, surely this would have caused major havoc for the Caliphs. Surely this would have caused a rebellion. It's very peculiar. And we have here not just an image of a man, we have an image of a practically naked man, almost fully naked. Okay, and there's a figure there going off to the side, which could be either a male or a female. It's hard to say. Seems to be draped with a blanket or a towel, maybe after coming out of the water. And there are crowds of people looking on in the background. This is scandalous stuff for the 730s. How is it possible that at that time they had pictures on the wall which were akin to what the Romans had 700 years earlier, without any seemingly awareness of prohibitions that are contained in hadiths supposedly spoken of by Muhammad originally? So there's a big problem. She goes on to say, and unfortunately I wasn't able to find the picture that she was referring to here in this one, but she says, in the middle of one wall of the audience hall, a semi-naked woman stands at the edge of a bath. She is watched by a group of men on a balcony, some of whom point at her, and one dressed in a bright blue robe on the far left leans forward over the railings to get a better view. A figure stands behind the bather, also gesturing at her, and another woman's head can just be seen above, peering down from a little window. No one is sure what the scene means, but it is full of drama. Perhaps some of the figures were portraits of real people. Maybe the man in blue is Al-Walid himself, or perhaps they represented the more abstract concepts or qualities. Now, it strikes me reading that this image, which appears to me to look like a man, certainly that looks like a male chest, maybe this was in fact a woman, which makes it even more scandalous than what I depicted. Bit of a very masculine looking woman, if it is a woman. I suppose it's not beyond the bounds of possibilities there. But yeah, an amazing thing to find inside a Caliph's palace. Now we have here a portrait of Al-Walid ibn Yazid on the south wall of the west aisle of the audience hall, again from the 730s. As you can see, he's depicted on his divan, and he's, in typical sort of Roman pose, leaning on his side. And he's sort of giant size in comparison to the others. I won't go so far as to say it's an idol, that, this image, but it certainly does kind of create a kind of cult personality around the Caliph with that massive image, probably a propaganda image, probably meant to impress the visitors. So quite incredible if images of people were meant to be banned. Now, of course, this is not in a mosque, but if the general principle is that images of people and animals might lead to idolatry, surely self-aggrandizement like this would have a temptation associated with them of adultery. Now she goes on to say, on other walls at Qasr Amra are portraits of the patron and images of kings, wrestlers, hunters, fishermen, dancers, musicians. I thought music was banned. And mythological characters. There is also a painted star chart in the dome of the sauna with the symbols for the Greco-Roman constellations. Now, this is a very Roman type of setup here when you have baths and saunas and all sort of things. These are the sort of places that all sort of sorted things like orgies